I mean, what helped me recover is that nobody gave up on me. Everybody still realized that I was still in there.
This is our humble hemp patch.
5,000 years of medical cannabis use.
We're learning about other cannabinoids.
Marijuana is grown in every state in the Union.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. What happens when a doctor gets addicted to opiates? What if seeking treatment might cost you your job? You would probably just keep it a secret while the grip of the addiction tightens. That's what Dr. Peter Grinspoon experienced. He is a physician who followed the cycle of addiction all the way down. But with some help, he broke the spell, and he wrote a really wonderful and brave book about that experience. High stress and easy access to drugs are built into the role of every medical professional, but access to help is not as easy to come by. Dr. Grinspoon's memoir, Free Refills, takes you on a journey of addiction and recovery, offering lots of insights for those with a troublesome relationship to substances and their loved ones. So if you know somebody who needs help with addiction but doesn't know how to find it, or if you just enjoy medical dramas and insightful, engaging speakers, then this interview is for you. And most importantly, if you think it's too late, listen to this episode. As a side note, I will apologize for the fluctuations in audio quality near the end of the interview. We had some technical difficulties. But that does just about seem right for a season finale episode. You never want things to be too perfect. So please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Peter Grinspoon, and we'll see you in January for Season 2 of the Lex Files. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Peter Grinspoon. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you wrote a great book called Free Refills, A Doctor Confronts His Addictions. And not only is it very well written, it's very brave. It's about you being an MD who gets addicted to pills. And my first question was, were you apprehensive as you were going through the writing and publishing process before you're going to release this for everybody in the world to see?
Well, I wasn't apprehensive going through the writing process. It was really cathartic. I honestly think journaling and writing helped me work through a lot of the guilt, a lot of the shame of being addicted and being a physician. The publishing process was a different thing. It's such a taboo subject, physicians and addiction. And I thought it was so important to just get out the message that physicians are people and we get addicted like everyone else. We actually get addicted more frequently than other people because we have such access to medications. That's why I called the memoir Free Refills. We have access to medications and we have so much stress. It's a perfect storm, a perfect combination for addiction. So I was somewhat apprehensive, but at the same time, quite a few years into recovery by the time I was publishing it, and I was already back practicing medicine. So I didn't think anything terrible was going to happen when I published it.
And what was the response like, the feedback to you coming out and I believe writing the first book about an MD being addicted to pills and telling their own story about it?
Well, the response was almost completely positive. Among my colleagues, it was completely positive. And there was much less negative response. Of course, on Twitter, people who didn't like some of my political tweets, maybe against Trump, would be like, oh, you're a drug addict, blah, blah, blah. But generally speaking, my colleagues were incredibly supportive, and a lot of people came to me like informally and were like, can you help me? A lot of physicians or nurses. What do I do? I'm trapped. Because one of the themes in my books and one of the problems is if you get into trouble as a physician, not just, and also as a nurse, not just with addiction, but also with like mental health problems, and you ask for help, you can get punished by the medical boards. They can take away your license instead of getting helped, in a nurturing, helpful, supportive way. So people are afraid to get help. So it's like the worst case scenario. I mean, people who are getting help for an addiction or for depression are safe. They're safe to practice. They're safe. They're not going to overdose. They're not going to kill themselves by and large. But people who are afraid to get help are the dangerous ones to themselves and to others. And if we have a climate where people are afraid to get help, that's the worst case scenario. So part of why I wrote this book is to destigmatize the entire issue so that hopefully people can learn about it, and we could change the system so that people won't be afraid to get help.
For people who are listening who are in the healthcare world and struggling with addiction, what advice would you have for them specifically about how to go about looking for help?
Well, you have to get help. You will get help one way or another. I didn't get help through the traditional means, and the way I got help was by having the state police and the DEA raid my office, having criminal charges, being put on probation. This is all in my memoir, Free Refills, being sent to this like really brain dead rehab place for 90 days, which I spent a lot of time in the book happily making fun of and satirizing, and losing my medical license for 3 years. And finally, after being monitored for 5 years by the physician health program, struggling to get my license back. So you will get help one way or another, because the addiction tends to take over and worsen and sort of colonize your brain. So find a way to get help either privately, be honest with yourself about your problem, or go through the physician health program. Talk to your supervisor. People will be empathic, and just say that you have a problem and get help either, again, privately or through the normal means, which is a physician health program. Almost all states have a physician health program. It's painful, but it's much less painful than what I went through, which is not getting help and having help imposed upon you as you're facing criminal charges and the loss of your medical license. So there's like the easy way and the hard way, and I would absolutely recommend you pick the easy way. But again, because of the nature of addiction, it's going to get worse and you're going to get help. So you might as well do it the easy way.
That's excellent advice. And I wanted to go back to the beginning of your story, because one thing that impressed me about your book is how you have a very famous father, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, famous for his advocacy of medical cannabis, but you really don't make much hay of that in the book. It's just a part of your life. You don't play the weed celebrity card. I wanted to hear what it was like to grow up in that household, and when did things start to feel different for you?
Your childhood is what you have for childhood. You don't have much to compare it to, so you don't realize that it's abnormal. I had the weirdest childhood environment. It was really fun in some ways. In other ways, it was very tragic. My dad was a legend in the cannabis legalization world. He was also a legend in the psychiatry world with like groundbreaking work in schizophrenia and with all drugs of misuse. He wrote books on psychedelic drugs, on cocaine, on psychostimulants, on drug policy. So he was really a visionary and a legend on all these drugs. My dad published a book on cannabis called Marijuana Reconsidered in 1971. It was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, and it had a glowing review, and it really became sort of the intellectual leadership of the legalization movement. And my dad was involved for 50 years with the legalization movement. Unfortunately, he just passed away about 3 months ago.
I'm sorry for your
he,
loss.
No, thank you. He also wrote another book in the 1990s called Marijuana: The Forbidden Medicine. And these two books were instrumental in, when he wrote Marijuana Reconsidered in the 1970s, early 1970s, support for legalization was about 12%, and now it's about 67%. And I really think that would not be the case without him. But anyways, yeah, so my childhood, my childhood living room growing up, there were always, groups of people either discussing legalization and peaceably sharing joints, or arguing about legalization and like yelling at each other. And like the cannabis issue was like a constant with my growing up. And there's some really famous people and really interesting conversations that I listened to. And I didn't get the impression of cannabis being associated with deadbeat stoners. I got the association of cannabis being associated with like the smartest intellectuals smoking it and having these like brilliant conversations. So I was brought up with like a completely different view of cannabis, both from seeing these brilliant people smoke it and have these like intensely amazing conversations, and also from the fact that my brother Danny unfortunately had leukemia when I was a kid, and my parents illegally got him cannabis, and it helped him hold down food for the last year of his life. Otherwise, he couldn't eat at all, and cannabis seemingly miraculously helped him eat. So I saw firsthand when I was like 8 years old that cannabis was an effective medicine, at least for that one disorder. So by the time I entered medical school, I was like, you know, had a totally different orientation towards cannabis than the other medical students, or at least most of them. And I was pretty immune from the nonsense they teach us in medical school about cannabis. What they teach us, or taught us at least, was basically warmed over drug war ideology. And I think we really need to reform the medical school curriculum about cannabis because it's pretty pathetic.
You got to start experimenting in high school and past that. And I was curious how your first personal experiences with drugs flavored all of the rest.
Well, yeah, I started using cannabis at a young age. It was all around me, and it was just like, it looked like fun. So, we tried it, and me and my brothers, and, you know, I was always a straight A student, if not an A plus student. So it never really affected me in school. And, I think it really helped my writing. Who knows if it had any long term effect? They say it affects IQ and memory. I don't feel like, I'm that much of a slacker. And, it just, it's hard to answer that question because I know as a doctor, I'm supposed to say that it has a bad effect on adolescence. But, as an adolescent, I actually felt like I had a good experience with it. So I'm just really conflicted on how to answer that.
What about once you switched to other drugs, more intense drugs?
Well, I always tried drugs. I'm like a risk taker, or at least I was. And like, I tried everything and I never had a problem. I would try one thing, move on. And it wasn't until I tried Vicodin in medical school that I developed a problem. It's really interesting. In one support group meeting, that I went to after being addicted, one doctor said I tried alcohol at age 14 and I never stopped drinking from that point on. And, alcohol, I could take it or leave it. I'll have a beer here or there, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't make me euphoric. And, at a book talk, one woman said I had Vicodin after a C-section and it didn't make me euphoric. I don't know how you can get addicted to it. And it did make me euphoric. So I think it's sort of brain and individual sensitive, probably genetic to a certain extent, how susceptible any one of us are to a particular drug. But the fact is, I experimented with like all drugs, like cocaine, ecstasy, mushrooms, acid, you name it. Never had a problem with anything. But then in medical school, when of course I was working all the time and stressed out, I tried Vicodin and it just made me so profoundly euphoric that I spent, unfortunately, the next 10 years or so trying to recreate that euphoria. And as I attained a prescription pad, I still somehow was a top student in medical school and in residency, but because that was always the last to go. But I ended up getting into so much mayhem with the prescription pad. But again, it just was the opiates that got me, none of the other drugs. But I think we have to be really careful if any of us experiment with drugs because you never know which one you're going to get hooked on.
It is a tough part of it. It does seem like everybody has their own individual holes to fill, and you never quite know what's going to be the drug or the behavioral addiction.
Absolutely. People get addicted to sex, to gambling, to shopping, to like being on the screen and the social media, and it can really damage their lives by supplanting more important things like going for walks, connecting with others, things that give you genuine happiness, not things that just stimulate the happiness center in your brain.
Do you remember any point when, with Vicodin, you felt like, oh, this is starting to become a little bit too big for me, or this is becoming something? I'm going to ignore that it's becoming something, but I'm starting to notice it.
Yeah, physicians are so good at being in denial. That's a huge part of why treating physicians is difficult. I was invited after I was in recovery to work as an associate director for the physician health services. And I sat at the same table, but on the other side of the table, helping other physicians with their addictions. and I saw the exact same thing that I saw in myself, just this denial. And it's so difficult to break through it. I'd be in my office at night alone, snorting oxycodone, and I'd be like, well, other doctors have a drink or two at night. That's an intoxicant. It's sort of arbitrary what's illegal and what's legal. So I'm just here snorting oxycodone. That's just a different intoxicant. There's nothing wrong with this. I mean, you're thinking it's so crazy when you're addicted. And doctors, everybody who's addicted, but doctors in particular, are so good at denial that you just warp the logic. So, there were a few times. Once I took too many pills, and I document this in my memoir, Free Refills, and I sort of woke up very scared, and I gave the pills to an addiction specialist, and he flushed them, and then he gave me some Suboxone, the medication to get off opiates, and I got off. But I didn't get into any sustained treatment. It's a chronic disease, and you need sustained treatment, and I just got off. But without sustained treatment, I just got back on again, so it didn't work. But yeah, there were inklings, flashes of, holy shit, what's going on? But nothing sustained enough to really keep me on the right track for more than a couple weeks at a time.
And you talked about in your book the 3 levels of Faustian bargaining that you went through, and the first being hunting and gathering. And so when you were there scrounging around for pills among different places, friends' houses and things like that, did it feel like the hunt itself was part of the addiction, being so clever and sharp-eyed and able to get away with it?
Well, yeah, it did. And I cringe to even talk about this because I feel so bad about it. But I think most of my friends and relatives realized that I was like sick, ill, and not really functioning. But, people think that most of the crazy things you do are on drugs. And, that's probably true if you're on methamphetamine and you're like, running around and jumping through windows and stuff or whatever, or cocaine, or on, maybe like take some synthetic drug. But I think like the craziest things I did was when I was drug seeking, looking for drugs, because my brain was not functioning, and I'd do anything to find drugs. And then when I actually took the opiates, I usually just like closed my eyes and felt euphoric. So yeah, the huge part of the addiction was like my drug seeking. That was like 60% of my conscious thought at any time was like, where am I going to get drugs? Where am I going to get opiates? I'm going to feel sick if I don't get opiates. I need opiates. I mean, it was like more and more and more. A bigger part of my conscious functioning brain was focused on obtaining opiates. And the things I did were less and less ethical and less well thought out. So it was crazy. So yeah, absolutely. That was a huge part of my addiction.
I'm very impressed that you can speak about it, even with the anxiety it can bring up, because I'm also in recovery, and I can talk about that stuff in the rooms, but to write a book about it is a pretty daunting task. I don't think I'll undertake anytime soon. So that's part of the reason I think this book is so important for anybody listening to read, is to see where all of us get or can get to. It's why I think this is so powerful. So I really appreciate you writing it. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, isn't it uncomfortable to talk about some of the things you did?
Yeah, or think about it. Just makes everything clench still 10,
Yeah,
15,
exactly.
20 years later.
I'm clenching.
Well, it's good you already are, because I was actually going to ask about the next 2 levels. It was then fraudulent prescriptions, and then colluding with patients. And you said that was the time when it really started to feel like you were of 2 minds at that point.
Yeah, I mean, there was still Peter, the responsible doctor who is generous and helpful. And then there was like this scheming, addicted mind at the same time that was like, oh, would literally do anything for drugs. Like, and I was just doing these unethical things, like writing prescriptions for my wife and picking them up, and like, as I said, colluding with patients, like, hey, I'll write you 110 instead of 100 if you give me 10 back, things like that. Things that like I can't even believe that I did. Like, it's just absolutely horrible, like completely unethical and like nuts. And again, it's just so out of character for me. And it just shows that the addiction just takes over so many different parts of your brain. I mean, not only does it take over the it changes how you look at consequences, and you focus much more on immediate relief from withdrawal, as opposed to, am I going to get in trouble for this? But it also affects your sense of right and wrong. Right and wrong become much more like, do I have drugs or do I not have drugs? Not, am I doing the wrong thing for this patient or towards my family or towards a friend? And it just warps your complete moral fabric, which is really amazing to me. I studied moral philosophy in college. I was a philosophy major, and addiction never came up, but that would be a really interesting subject. Like, how does addiction affect a person's moral choices? And I could answer very, very poorly, and you feel very bad about it when you enter into recovery. You don't really think about it until you enter recovery because it hurts too much to think about it. But once you get into recovery, it's just you feel really bad. But you also learn a lot about addiction, and it helps me treat people with addiction because I've been through it and I sort of know the mind frame.
At CV Sciences, we love our full spectrum hemp products. But for some people with sensitive jobs or sensitive systems, they want something with 0% THC. So we created a line of products called Happy Lane. Made with CBD from hemp grown in Kentucky, we have gummies, we have chews, we have liquids, we have soft gels, and we've the always beloved CBD roll-ons for applying to your skin. Everything is non-GMO, vegan, purity tested, and manufactured in the United States. So when life has you wound up, tense, agitated, antsy, uptight, jittery, or jumpy, try our Happy Lane line of CBD products. For 25% off, use the coupon code Lex Files at pluscbd.com.
What advice would you offer someone who is at that stage in the addiction game right now, where they're feeling it start to take over, but they know how painful it's going to be to actually face this thing? What would you recommend or say, or what would you say to a patient who came in at that level of addiction?
I'd have a very frank talk with them. I'd probably use my own story, and I'd say, look, it feels like you're getting away with it, and it feels like what you're doing could go on forever, but it's not sustainable. And, I'm not a fan of Alcoholics Anonymous because I don't like the judgmentalism and the hyper religiosity. But, in the big book, they do say that addiction will end in jails, institutions, or death. And I do sort of agree with that. Like, it's going to end with you overdosing or locked up somewhere. And, you'll lose your family, you'll lose your job. I just explain what's going to happen. And then I offer the treatment. We have Suboxone or buprenorphine, and we can help people get off. So I paint a really realistic picture of what's going to happen. And then I offer a pathway out. And I really appeal to them. And sometimes I'll involve family members in the discussion and just appeal to them, again, often like explaining my experience, which I think helps people feel like I'm not some, lofty doctor, dictating a hypothetical scenario. I'm actually like connected to them. And I really try to get them to make a good decision. And it's very hard when you're addicted.
You mentioned family. Sometimes the family members can be helpful in their interventions and sometimes not at all. And you mentioned things in your book that certainly struck home with you, even if they weren't the thing that completely changed where you were at. If you were talking to a family member of someone struggling with addiction, what type of interventions or care would you recommend that they try?
Well, one of the hardest things there is being a family member to someone who's actively addicted. And on the one hand, you do have to set up boundaries. You can't have them like stealing your money and making you feel uncomfortable or unsafe or like they're taking advantage of you. But on the other hand, this whole approach that was pushed by the addiction community, a lot of the addiction treatment community is just like so off base about addiction. It's like one of the biggest ironies, but that's a whole nother discussion. But if you're in recovery, I think you know what I mean. But, they have been espousing for decades this thing called tough love. Like, cut the addict, we're not supposed to use the word addict off. Addict is stigmatizing, but cut the addict off and let him or her find their bottom, and then they'll come to their senses and they'll come crawling back and they'll be ready for treatment. And, what happened is they do that and these people end up dead. And basically, as we say, dead addicts don't recover. You don't do that. You don't cut them off and make them fend for themselves, because these days they're just going to overdose in fentanyl and die. You don't give up on people. You set boundaries, but you don't give up on them. You keep a lifeline intact. And you realize, what helped me recover is that nobody gave up on me. Everybody still realized that I was still in there, even though I was behaving very poorly. And because no one gave up on me, I still had that lifeline. And that's part of what helped me continue and make it through. So you have to not give up on the addicted person in your family. You have to set boundaries to protect yourself. Just take care of, put on your oxygen mask first, but don't give up on the person. You've got to keep chipping away at it, letting them know you're there for them, and keep trying to get them help.
That's great advice. And I know it can be really hard for people, but that's really powerful advice. And one thing that you talked about in your book is the importance of privilege and how that plays into your story of addiction, as well as the American story of addiction, and how different the opportunities are for people who can't afford softer landing pads than low-level addiction centers, which are, I think in your book you said, are often worse than nothing. And I was wondering if you could speak to that as a doctor who sees all kinds of people, how privilege plays into this and what you think could help with that situation.
Well, privilege played a tremendous role in my case. If I were African American, I don't think I would have just gotten off with probation for 2 years and then no criminal record. I think I probably would have gone to jail, or at least had legal complications for decades, if not for life. I think, the system is just so completely biased. Not to mention, I was able to get a top lawyer, and I'm sure the medical board isn't colorblind unconsciously, even though they pretend they are. And I was able to get my license back. I think every institution I went through, I had the benefit of my privilege. So I, on the one hand, feel very guilty about that. And on the other hand, I'm glad to have my license back so that I could help other people. And I work in an inner city clinic working with very impoverished patients. So I feel like I'm using my license to do a lot of good. It was only, when it was a crack epidemic and it was affecting predominantly African Americans in the inner city, our society's response was lock them up, throw away the key. Once the opiate epidemic started affecting white people in the suburbs, society started saying, hey, maybe people who suffer from addiction are people, let's be sympathetic to them. So on the one hand, I think it's horribly racist that we only started being sympathetic to people suffering from addiction once it started to affect white people. On the other hand, I'm really happy that we are being more sympathetic to people with addiction, all people now, of all colors, and that we are treating it as a disease, not a moral failing. So it's just sort of complicated, and our society has an incredible amount of racism that it's got to work through. And, that comes out a lot in, the marijuana arrests and the drug war, which is a disaster. I personally think drugs should be legal and the whole system should be run by public health officials, doctors, and scientists, and that involving law enforcement just ruins lives and doesn't do anything else. And I think that, again, racism is mostly what runs. Racism and greed are the two things that run the war on drugs. I think our society has a lot of problems. And yes, I just gave a long TED talk to circle back to the fact that privilege did play a very large role in the fact that I wrote 3 felony prescriptions and got caught and ended up without a criminal record and back practicing medicine, though I worked really hard at it, did everything I was supposed to do, and it took like 3.5 years. But yes, privilege did play a big role.
I'm really glad to hear you taking a stance like that on the war on drugs, and surprised to hear someone of your stature saying, legalize everything, because it's still a pretty radical idea, even though there's a lot of smart people saying it. So I appreciate that from you.
It's such a cash cow for law enforcement. And I just feel like criminalizing drugs just enriches law enforcement. They love all the military equipment. They love the asset forfeiture where they get to just take assets from people they suspect of having drugs. All it does is make the drug supply more dangerous, because if the drug supply were legal, people use drugs anyways. It doesn't have any effect on the use of drugs. It doesn't stop drug use. It just makes the supply of drugs more dangerous. I mean, we look at what happened when they prohibited alcohol. It was a disaster. People died from moonshine and methanol poisoning, and they drank anyways. And then we look at the legalization of cannabis, which has been such a success. There's tax revenue, and people are using a safer supply, and teen rates haven't gone up, and it's now a regulated, safer product. So it just, and it's creating jobs. So it just is so much safer and so much smarter, in my opinion, to legalize these drugs and to tax them and to make them safe, to educate people, to tell the truth, not to like give people drug war hysteria, misinformation about them, and just get law enforcement out of it, because we just can't keep arresting people and throwing them in prison. That just, all that does is ruin people's lives. It doesn't do, and that's much worse for people than the actual drugs themselves.
And that's a great point. And speaking of cash cows, another one is the rehab industry. And I know that in a lot of recovery circles, the rehab industry can be seen as very predatory, and there are some aspects of that. But some rehabs are really amazingly places, especially for some people that's what they're looking for. And one line that really struck home from your book was from your friend who you named Lyle in the book, who you met in rehab. And he said, rehab is an awesome experience. Too bad you have to be a drunk or a druggie to do it. And so I know you satirized rehab some in your book, but I was wondering if you could speak to what some of the positives were you saw for yourself and other people, and what some of the negatives were as well.
Well, the positives were just taking time out of my life to fix it. It was obviously very broken. If I were on heavy duty narcotics every day, my marriage was falling apart. I was in trouble at work and was miserable. And I just needed time away. And I had a lot of group therapy with a great group and a great leader. And, they just sort of traced back and tried to figure out what went wrong. And, they really sort of said, let's forget about the doctor part. Just let's figure out who you were before you were a doctor, and what do you like to do, and what gets you interested, and what kind of things do get you wanting to wake up in the morning. And I thought, really connection with other people is important. Writing's really important to me, reading, stuff like that. And, and then we built back the doctor part in a way that was hopefully healthy and sustainable, not destined for burnout and cynicism like is happening to a majority of doctors these days. And so I thought that part of it was really helpful. The parts that aren't helpful is many rehabs don't use medication for opiate use disorder. They are just like completely in the Middle Ages about this. They're not science-based at all. And, they just don't have good medical care. Like in my case, I was on a big dose of Klonopin, which is like Valium, and you're supposed to taper someone off that for over like 2 years. And they took me off cold turkey, which is like life-threatening. Like that's like the most insane thing I've ever heard of, and put me on 3 other medications so that I wouldn't have a fatal seizure. I mean, it was like the worst medical care. You couldn't even make this stuff up. And, they also have you just like repeating religious platitudes for days on end, hoping that that's going to magically cure you of an opiate addiction. I mean, I really don't think rehab does anything except, in a sense, keep you away from the drugs for a while, and then you go back and hope you don't overdose. And in some ways, rehab is dangerous because I don't think it really does much for you. And then people lose their tolerance while they're at rehab, and they go back and they start injecting drugs at the same level that they did before rehab, and they're more susceptible to overdose. Again, some rehab places are more modern and are using medications, but most of them aren't, and most of them aren't science-based, and I think most of them are extremely predatory. And I honestly think it would be great if we just obliterated the entire rehab industrial complex, started from scratch, maybe designed some residential programs to be science-based and evidence-based with modern medical care and with people who are trained. Most of the staff at most rehab places, their training is they're in recovery from addiction. I mean, that's great, but that's not sufficient training to help people. And I think that treatment as an outpatient, where you have these partial day programs and you work with a team as an outpatient with an addiction psychiatrist, a recovery coach, a primary care doctor, a social worker, and a therapist, and you go to group therapy all day as an outpatient is less expensive. And if you have access to all the modern medications, it's probably far more effective than rehab. So I personally think rehab is not effective. It's predatory in general, not all of them. It bankrupts families, and it has a very low track record of helping people with addiction. So I'm not a huge fan of rehab at all.
Wow, drop the bomb.
Well, I just like to be honest. I mean, I just, the stuff we did was so nutty. We would have a lecture for an hour on letting go and letting God. And halfway through the lecture, I'd raise my hand and be like, what does that mean? Sincere question. And they'd be like, don't cause trouble. And then they go back to mumbling, letting go and letting God. And I'd be like, then I start trying to read a book, and they'd be like, don't read a book during this important lecture. And then they go back to mumbling about letting go and letting God. And I still don't know what letting go and letting God means. And I'm like, why did you waste so much of my time with this? How is that going to, help my opiate addiction? I mean, it was the most brain dead thing I've ever gone through in my entire life. Some of the things I went through at rehab.
Well, that makes me a little nervous to even ask about your opinions on 12-step programs. They've been quite helpful for me, and I know they're helpful for some. But I know in the book you write that you had trouble even with the beginning with the higher power concept. And I was wondering if you just talk about how you came to what you used for higher power and what you think of 12-step now that you've been in recovery for quite some time.
Honestly, the 12 steps help some people, and I'm not against anything that helps some people recover. The 12 steps come from Alcoholics Anonymous from 1937, and they haven't really evolved much since then. So they're sort of an old-fashioned way to recover. But if they help people, they're great. I always wonder whether the 12 steps help people just because they get people together in a community, and that I wonder if there's anything particular to the 12 steps, if it could be the 5 principles instead of the 12 steps. Anything that gets people together in community, I'm guessing would help people recover, and it has nothing to do with the 12 steps per se. That's just my theory. But the 12 steps do help people, some people recover, so I'm not against them. I would say my recovery, even though I was forced into a 12-step program, had nothing to do with the 12 steps. And I don't think they should force people into 12-step programs. I think if they have to force someone into a program, they need to give people a choice of what programs they go into, because it's pretty painful if you're not really engaged in the 12 steps to have to go over them again and again. So again, I'm not against the 12 steps if they help people, but they need to be voluntary. And you need to choose whether or not you're going to go into a 12-step program, because they are pretty excruciating if you're not bought into them.
I wanted to ask about how you're feeling now that you've been in recovery for quite some time, and I assume feeling a lot better. What life looks like at this point after hearing about the rock bottoms that you read about in the book, and now getting back to being able to practice again.
There is so much more to being in recovery than not taking drugs. I mean, it's really about whether it's 12-step or not 12-step. It's really about sort of figuring out what's wrong in your life, why you were so miserable that you had to rely on drugs, and not just getting rid of the drugs, but finding a way to make yourself kind of more happy and comfortable in the world so you can get by without the drugs. And there's so much more to recovery than not taking the drugs. I mean, you learn about humility, about mindfulness, about connecting with other people, about listening. It was really interesting. I had spine surgery. Of course, you're going to have to use opiates if you have something like spine surgery or a knee replacement. So I couldn't believe these people were saying this. Like, I couldn't believe, like, one of these guys was a court-appointed counselor, and I complained to my probation officer. I'm like, this guy needs to be fired. He's a moron. And she said, you know, you're not really supposed to say that because you're a probationee. And I'm like, well, too bad. He's still a moron. But they never fired him. But he's like saying you never need opiates ever again. But anyways, so obviously with spine surgery, where they cut through the skin, the muscle, and the bone and muck around with the nerves, you need opiates for a couple of days. It was totally different when you're much happier later in life, taking 2 Percocet as needed. You don't even like the euphoria, the little bit of euphoria, because it reminds you of where you were in that miserable time in your life, versus snorting 10 when you're really unhappy. And it was no problem taking the opiates as directed. I even, got rid of them after a few days, and it just wasn't a problem. So I was really happy, and that made me think I was really, it's been like 13 years, but it really made me feel like I'd beat this thing if I could take the drugs appropriately, without cravings, without problems, without even wanting to finish the bottle. So I felt really good about that.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. It's really inspiring to me personally, and I bet it's inspiring to a lot of people listening right now as well. And speaking of everyone listening and myself, do you have any words of advice for people who might be struggling with addiction in their own life?
Well, yeah, get help. There's no shame. Tons of people get addicted. And the only way you can go wrong is if you don't ask for help. It's really hard, if not impossible, to get over this by yourself. And they say the opposite of addiction isn't necessarily recovery, it's connection with other people. And the problem is with addiction, you start to replace connection with other people with connection with the drug. And then you get into this vicious cycle of like getting more and more involved with the drug, and then it starts to take over your thoughts. But you just have to get help. It is so worth it, because, as one of my addiction counselors said to me, if you just stop taking drugs, or I guess drinking alcohol, everything's going to work out. You will end up so much happier. It's just you have to go through an uncomfortable process to get there. But you will get help, as I said before. You're just going to get help the hard way, not the easy way. And you could either get help on your terms by seeking it out in a friendly way, or you're going to get help later in a really ugly, unpleasant way. So I would just urge you to get help as soon as possible, to be humble, to be open, to be vulnerable, to not feel bad about yourself. This happens to tons of people. Like 9% of the population gets addicted sometime during their life, 1 in 10 people. And just to go for it and be open and honest and get help.
Thanks for that great advice. To everybody listening, the book is Free Refills. Our guest is Dr. Peter Grinspoon, and he's very active on Twitter. We'll have the links to that in the episode notes. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on and sharing from your experiences today.
Thanks for having me. This was a great discussion.
All right, until next time. Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, find us at pluscbdoil.com or on YouTube or on all the podcast platforms. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com or follow the podcast on Twitter at The Lex Files Show. If you enjoyed this program, please rate us on iTunes or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. Our chief advisor is Amabel Dela Cruz. The music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. And our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. Remember the coupon code LEXFILES. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.